In the past few weeks, I watched a lot of videos about the conflict between China and Taiwan. And every time, we take it for granted that China will invade Taiwan. But never the other way around, a Taiwanese invasion of China. And even saying this is inaccurate because both are China. We have the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China, aka Taiwan. And both claim to be the real China. Now I'm not kidding, despite the slight disproportion of forces. Deep into the archives, somewhere in there full of dust, Taiwan still has a plan on how they will liberate mainland China. The plan is called Project National Glory. You'll discover top secret Taiwanese amphibious raids, Taiwanese airborne commandos dropped behind enemy lines, as well as two little military accidents that contributed to the survival of an independent Taiwan. Hi and welcome to History Legends. Here's my first video of a series about China and Taiwan. And as always, here we cut the BS and talk about what the media doesn't tell you. And this video wouldn't be possible without the support of my patrons and PayPal supporters. Thank you to everyone and welcome to the headquarters. Disclaimer, this was only supposed to be an introduction for another video about Taiwan and China. But when I realized that it would be over 20 minutes long, I said, you know what? The introduction is going to be a self-standing video. The Qing Empire. Let's start our story in 1683, when the island of Formosa, the old name for Taiwan, became part of the Qing Empire. The Qing Empire was the largest imperial dynasty in the history of China, and by 1790, the fourth largest empire in world history in terms of territorial size. By 1912, China already had a population of 432 million people, and was the world's most populous country at the time. Here you can see the extent of the Qing Empire in 1820, with Chinese provinces in yellow, military governorates and protectorates in light yellow, as well as tributary states in orange. As you can see, it was massive. It ranged from the Sakhalin Islands up to Central Asia, and from Mongolia up to Taiwan. And this is where things get very interesting. Shortly after this map, things went downhill for China, and fast. What really brought the empire to its knees was the Taiping Rebellion from 1850 to 1864, which left 30 million people dead. Amidst the chaos, foreign nations chopped up the empire to pieces. Like that, in 1895, the Qing dynasty suffered a decisive defeat against Japan in the First Sino-Japanese War, and was forced to cede Formosa and the Pescadores to the Japanese Empire. Drama continued on the Chinese mainland, and a couple of years later, in 1911, revolutionaries toppled the Qing dynasty and established the Republic of China, where one general would rise to prominence. Although ethnically Chinese, he went to military school in Tokyo and even served in the Imperial Japanese Army from 1909 to 1911. His name, Chiang Kai-shek. And he would then become the leader of the political party known as the Kuomintang, the Chinese Nationalist Party, and the founder of modern-day Taiwan. Already in those days, the loss of Taiwan would become a rallying point for the Chinese nationalist movement, as they completely rejected the treaty signed between the Qing dynasty and Imperial Japan. The Japanese occupation of Taiwan. On the eve of the First Sino-Japanese War, the population of Taiwan was around 2.5 million. 2.3 million of them were Han Chinese, many whom emigrated during the Qing dynasty, and the remaining 200,000 were Taiwanese aboriginals. It took a couple years for the Japanese army to put down rebellions around the island, and already in those days, opposition was divided in two groups: pro-Taiwan independence, and those that wanted the return of Taiwan to Chinese rule. But many others were eager to become Japanese subjects, partially because Japan quickly pushed infrastructural developments such as Taiwan's railroad system, improved irrigation, the modernization of many ports, and the installation of a hydroelectric power plant. So much that Taiwan became the most developed region in East Asia after Japan. By 1905, Taiwan was financially self-sufficient. And by 1925, Taiwan became a major food basket serving the Japanese industrial economy. The Japanese also developed a healthcare system that was widely established, and infectious diseases were almost completely eradicated. For that reason, many just went along with the Japanese colonial authorities. That's how 207,000 Taiwanese, 1 in every 5 men in age to fight, served in the military of Imperial Japan during World War II. The majority served as Chinese language translators or as sailors in the Japanese Navy. Lee Teng-hui, the first democratically elected president of Taiwan, was one of those Taiwanese that served in the Imperial Japanese Army. In 1944, he volunteered for service and became a second lieutenant in command of an anti-aircraft gun. His brother was killed in action in the Philippines while serving in the Imperial Japanese Navy, and his remains were never recovered. Another incentive was that the families of those who served were given extra food and other rationed articles. But everything took a sharp turn at the end of World War II. With the capitulation of Japan and the Chinese Civil War flaming up again, nationalist troops quickly took over the island of Taiwan and expropriated the 500,000 ethnic Japanese inhabitants. If at first many Taiwanese celebrated this liberation, the nationalists saw Taiwanese war veterans as race traitors for serving in the Japanese military. And overall, the Kuomintang's corrupt administration quickly led to discontent on the island. The Chinese Civil War. Fun fact, did you know that Chiang Kai-shek, the founder of modern-day Taiwan, the leader of the nationalist movement, was Christian? He was a member of the Methodist Church, and the United States saw in him the hope of a Christian and democratic China. And did you know that his wife, known as Madame Chiang, was educated in the United States and spoke perfect English, which convinced Americans to name Chiang as Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the China War Zone. The Chinese Civil War between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party started in 1927, and there was a little break during the Japanese invasion, but right after, restarted in 1946. I won't go too much in detail, but what you have to know is that by the end of 1948, early 1949, most of the mainland fell to the communists, mostly thanks to Papa Stalin. The communists took over the national capital of Nanjing, which was then transferred to Guangzhou, and then finally towards Chengdu. The situation was getting desperate. Chiang Kai-shek and his troops were really getting pressed by communist forces. The Kuomintang had to evacuate, but how? They were 2,000 kilometers away from the sea. The only way out was either to move towards Central Asia or south towards Burma. Chiang Kai-shek was saved by his old friend Chennault, the founder of the Flying Tigers. He returned to China with the purchase of several surplus military aircraft and created the Civil Air Transport. Within 4 months, with 50 to 80 flights a day, American planes managed to airlift 640,000 civilians and 580,000 soldiers to Taiwan. The island was the perfect place to settle and rebuild forces as it benefited from natural defenses and modern infrastructure from the Japanese occupation. What most people don't know is that quickly after, Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang aimed at full political control over the island. The hostility of the Taiwanese population grew against the Kuomintang. Chiang Kai-shek launched a terror campaign against political opponents, nowadays known as the White Terror, and martial law was declared in Taiwan on the 19th of May 1949. It is believed that 3,000 to 4,000 people were executed, which does not include 228 incidents where another 18,000 to 28,000 died in extrajudicial executions. And on top of that, 140,000 were imprisoned. And the method was not new to Chiang Kai-shek. In 1927, he purged thousands of suspected communists and dissidents. 300,000 people were executed by the Kuomintang. One of the most famous quotes from Chiang Kai-shek was that he would rather mistakenly kill 1,000 innocent people than allow one communist to escape. This might be shocking, but this was literally the Chinese way of doing things for centuries. If you didn't know, Chinese civil wars were among the bloodiest wars in human history, and now you understand why. In the meantime, most American observers expected Chiang's government to fall quickly to an imminent invasion of Taiwan, and there was reason to worry. On the military front, the PLA, or the People's Liberation Army, the armed forces of the communists, did not want to allow the nationalists to rest and recover. So in the summer of 1949, they planned the invasion of Kinmen and Dengbu Islands, located right off the coast of the mainland. These preparations, of course, did not go unnoticed. The nationalists immediately sent more reinforcements to these islands. In addition to a few former Japanese military fortifications on the island, nationalist forces built field fortifications and obstacles were laid in the landing areas. And at the same time, the Air Force of the Republic of China bombed any gathering of PLA ships near Kinmen or Dengbu Islands. to the point where communist forces faced a serious shortage of ships. The first island to be attacked would be the largest of the two, Kinmen. The PLA launched the offensive on October 25, 1949, but because of a lack of ships, the initial landing force could only consist of 3 regiments, 9,000 troops transported by 300 wooden junks and fishing boats. Yeah, they didn't really have amphibious landing crafts. Nonetheless, the communists were pretty confident. Just like in the past, they expected the 40,000 strong ROC garrison to surrender without a fight. ROC, Republic of China. But the beach landing was a disaster. The PLA landing force, lacking intelligence, landed at Guaning 2 points, which just happened to be the most heavily defended place on the island. And this is where military accident number 1 happened. A couple of nationalist M3 stewards just happened to be on the beach when PLA troops disembarked. It was a massacre. The tanks fired at point blank. Now the thing is, after disembarking their troops, the wooden boats were meant to return to the mainland and pick up the second wave. But before they could do so, 18 P-51 fighter jets that took off from Taiwan showed up. They destroyed more than 100 sailboats transported by the first wave. And shortly after, this is where military accident number 2 happened. The ROC landing ship, Chunglong, just happened to be at Kinmen the day of the offensive. And it showed up and with its cannons just ripped through the wooden junks. The land force, the navy, and the air force, all 3 destroyed the 300 boats of the PLA, which meant that no communist reinforcements could come rescue their comrades. Fighting was fierce, but by the afternoon of October 28, the PLA was stuck in a tiny beachhead, had suffered 3,873 killed, and had run out of ammunition and food. The remaining 5,175 surrendered. Meanwhile, nationalists lost 6,000 KIA or wounded during the many counterattacks. And in early November, from the 3rd to the 6th, 1949, once again the nationalists pushed back communist forces at the Battle of Dengbu Island. These unexpected victories led Mao to completely put off his planned invasion of Taiwan. But despite the communists having little experience in amphibious warfare, they learned from their mistakes. This time, the invasion force consisted of 60,000 men embarked in over 2,000 wooden boats. But they would not attack Taiwan. In March 1950, they successfully landed and captured the island of Hainan. And this time, the nationalist evacuation turned into a complete fiasco. And very few of the 100,000 defenders managed to escape. Taiwan would have lost significance at the eyes of the United States had it not been for the Korean War. Plans to reconquer mainland China. As we've seen, in 1949, the nationalist forces withdrew from the mainland toward Taiwan and miraculously managed to repulse PLA amphibious landings. The Republic of China was viewed by the vast majority of countries at the time as a legitimate representative of China, as a successor of the Qing dynasty. So despite losing the Chinese Civil War all his life, Chiang Kai-shek remained committed to reconquer the mainland, and he would use Taiwan as his forward operating base. This operation was called Project National Glory. Not many people know this, but not all the nationalists in Chengdu managed to escape to Taiwan. Many had no other choice but to withdraw towards Burma, from where they continued the fight using guerrilla tactics in the jungle. Many of whom already knew the area because this is where they fought the Japanese a couple years earlier. By March 1950, there were about 1,500 Kuomintang troops at the China-Burma border. By April 1951, that number rose to 4,000. And by the end of the year, it would reach 6,000. And by 1952, it would double to 12,000. The Kuomintang wanted to use Burma as a refuge to reorganize, train, and equip themselves for the purpose of launching an invasion to retake mainland China. This army survived thanks to secret CIA support, but mostly supported itself through opium cultivation and distribution to Thailand. Essentially one of the first revolutionary drug cartels. Under the command of General Li Mi, in May 1951, Kuomintang forces launched an offensive into Yunnan province involving around 20,000 men. The core of this army was composed of Kuomintang troops, but a lot of Burmese volunteers joined them. The nationalists advanced 80 kilometers before the 40,000 strong PLA army counterattacked and drove them back. Li Mi's army suffered heavy losses. They tried again 2 months later in July 1951 and again in August 1952. after which they never invaded Yunnan again. Now, as you can imagine, the Burmese government was not pleased to have these Kuomintang rebels in the north of the country. With reason, they feared that the presence of these anti-communist Kuomintang troops on their border could antagonize communist China and provide it with an excuse to invade Burma. And indeed, at the time of the Korean War that involved both the United States and China, such fear was not unfounded. To avoid such a disaster scenario, the Americans pressured Chiang Kai-shek to withdraw his troops from the China-Burma border. In May 1954, 7,000 Kuomintang soldiers were airlifted to Taiwan. Some die-hard nationalists stayed behind to continue the anti-communist fight. But by April 1961, Taiwan evacuated the remaining 4,400 Kuomintang guerrillas. The Taiwan Strait crisis. Now, after the failure of the Burma expedition, the Republic of China did not have a direct border with the communists anymore. So the new objective was to reconquer the provinces of Fujian and Guangdong, from which many ROC soldiers and Taiwanese came from. From 1951 to 1954, the nationalists raided China's coastline from the small islands they controlled near the mainland, using commandos trained by the CIA. Now emboldened by American support and the Korean War, Chiang Kai-shek offered to attack Communist China while their attention was diverted in Korea. However, this operation was declined by the United States, simply because the Americans did not want the Korean War to escalate. Now Chiang Kai-shek, perhaps through religious fervor, persisted, and by August 1954, the nationalists placed 58,000 troops on Kinmen and another 15,000 troops on Matsu Islands, where they started improving defensive structures. Seeing this threat at their doorstep, the Premier of the People's Republic of China responded with a declaration on August 11, 1954. Taiwan must be liberated. He immediately dispatched the PLA to this area and started shelling Kinmen and Matsu. And due to this continuous shelling on the 3rd of September, 2 American advisors were killed. Communist China really didn't like all these little nationalist islands, only a couple kilometers from the coast. Who knows what the nationalists could do? And some, like the Yishungshan Islands, were not too far away from the big city of Shanghai. You can imagine the political disaster if the communists actually lost Shanghai. For that reason, on the 18th of January 1955, 5,000 communist troops attacked the nationalist garrison of the Yishungshan Islands. 2 days later, half of the 1,000 defenders were killed and the other half was captured. Problem is, for the Republic of China, these islands were very far away from their base. So in February 1955, the US Navy, with 132 ships and 400 aircraft, evacuated 14,500 civilians and 14,000 soldiers from the remaining Dashan Islands. And 3 days after the evacuation, these islands were immediately captured by the People's Liberation Army. Full of resentment, Chiang Kai-shek allowed these islands to fall to the communists to ensure that Kinmen and Matsu could be successfully defended. He knew that if he spread his forces, he could effectively lose them all. Chiang Kai-shek's son, Ching Kuo, was inspired by the Budapest uprising. He believed that a victory required a popular and armed anti-communist rebellion. Only then nationalist forces could launch an amphibious assault to support them. What he failed to realize is that just like the nationalists purged political opponents in Taiwan, the Communist Party did the same in the mainland to an even bigger scale with an estimated 2 million deaths between 1950 and 1953. Once again, anyone suspected to be a nationalist was put against the wall. But this really restricted the pool of people that could take part in such a counter-revolution. In 1958, communist forces resumed shelling against Kinmen and the Matsu Islands, known as the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis. The main objective was to probe the extent of the United States' defenses of Taiwan's territory. And in August 1958, a naval battle took place near the island of Dongding. The first attack involved 4 Chinese communist gunboats and 6 small landing crafts, while the second involved 5 Chinese communist gunboats and 30 motorized junks. Both attacks were driven off by 7 nationalist patrol crafts. In 1961, the Republic of China assessed that conditions for war with the People's Republic of China were becoming favorable. The idea was to airdrop or disembark 2,000 commandos behind enemy lines in order to spark a revolutionary movement to topple the CCP and build partisan operations near the coastline. After that, using the island of Kinmen as springboard, Phase 1 would start with a surprise amphibious landing of 270,000 nationalist troops against the city of Xiamen. This attack would take over a third of Taiwan's mobilized military strength. However, nationalists knew that such a buildup of forces would alert communist leaders. They estimated that PLA reinforcements were expected to arrive 5 days before the landing, so any landing would meet an immediate counterattack. For this operation, the Republic of China estimated their losses at 50,000 casualties. With the landing successful, Phase 2 would start. They would push inland, taking advantage of unrest and local anti-communist guerrillas. But that was pretty much the planning for Phase 2. As you can imagine, it was way too ambiguous for a military operation, so nothing concrete beyond Phase 1 was actually planned. Nationalist commanders self-evidently acknowledged the difficulties of simply achieving Phase 1, as it stretched available manpower and exceeded available sea and airlift for troops and logistics. Also, the commando operations did not go as planned. Taiwan asked the United States to provide them with 5 C-123 transport aircraft, 16 B-57 bombers, and 25 tank landing craft to support the landing of small units of the Republic of China near Hong Kong. And as a reminder, Hong Kong was still under British rule. Now, from December 1962 to November 1963, small groups of anti-communist commandos landed in Guangdong and Fujian provinces. But according to the People's Republic of China, by 1965, a total of 40 Kuomintang armed agents and 594 partisans were eliminated, and less than one-third of the 1,800 nationalist commandos who participated in the operation survived. Chiang Kai-shek was well aware that US support was a necessary precondition for an open confrontation with the People's Republic of China. Tensions rose once again when Communist China successfully launched its first nuclear test in October 1964. And by June 1965, Chiang Kai-shek had waited long enough and decided to proceed on his own without US approval. In late June, a first amphibious landing exercise in southern Taiwan caused the death of over 10 soldiers when strong waves overturned the 5 amphibious assault vehicles. On August 6th, 2 nationalist warships carrying troops to conduct a reconnaissance of the mainland were intercepted and sunk by the PLA Navy torpedo boats near Dongshan Island, resulting in the death of 200 nationalist personnel. In November, the Republic of China's warships Shanghai and Linwai were intercepted by the PLA on their way to the islands of Magang and Wokyu to pick up wounded troops. During this naval battle, the Linwai was sunk by 2 torpedoes and 90 personnel were killed. So that alone gives you an idea of the combat readiness of the nationalist troops in Taiwan. But they were so convinced that they would win. In the fall of 1965, the Republic of China offered to aid the US in the Vietnam War. You know it! By invading Guangdong province. This offer was swiftly rejected by the Americans, and ultimately no Taiwanese invasion was launched. The counter-revolutionary movement failed to materialize. Nationalists had a hard time completing training exercises and recon missions. And above all, the US absolutely did not want China to intervene in the Vietnam War by sending hundreds of thousands of troops like they did in Korea. That really traumatized the Americans. Yet not all hope was lost for Taiwan. In 1966, the Communist Party began its Cultural Revolution, which once again caused the death of tens of thousands. And Taiwan began reviewing its plans to exploit this unrest. In 1967, Chiang Kai-shek was confident that this was a moment to strike, and once again asked the US for help for his invasion. Once again, the request was rejected. As the war in Vietnam was winding down, the window of opportunity for Chiang Kai-shek was closing and fast. The dream was shattered on the 28th of February 1972 when President Richard Nixon signed the Shanghai Communique. The United States and the People's Republic of China were no longer enemies, and the US removed its military personnel from Taiwan. And shortly after, in July of the same year, Project National Glory was abolished. Chiang Kai-shek died in 1975. By the early 1990s, with economic relations improving between Taiwan and China, with the end of the Cold War, Taiwan would abandon the policy of using force for reunification and prefer to adopt a fully defensive posture. And in 1996, Taiwan held its first direct presidential elections. And this is where we're at today. 2 Chinas, 1 democratic, and one authoritarian. This is all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this extended introduction about the conflict between China and Taiwan. Let me know if you learned anything new that would make me extremely happy. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And as always, this video was made possible thanks to my patrons and PayPal supporters. So if you want the show to keep running, please join them.